This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at NumberFire.com, and this is episode 291 of the Late Round Podcast, one of the many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. As always, thanks for tuning in. Before looking at players I'm higher and lower on versus the consensus this week, I want to let you guys know about FanDuel's Sunday Million contest, where there's $3 million in prizes up for grabs here in Week 5. For just a $9 entry fee, take your shot at the $1 million first place prize this Sunday with the added wrinkle of FanDuel's $50,000 overtime TD bonus. Simply roster a player in your Sunday Million lineup that scores a touchdown in overtime, and you'll win a share of $50,000 in bonus cash in addition to any other prizes you win. For more details, visit FanDuel.com or download the FanDuel app today. Eligibility restrictions apply. So at quarterback this week, I'm going to start with two guys from the same game. That game's in Cincinnati, where the Cardinals are facing the Bengals. I really like the potential in this game. Arizona's running at the fastest pace in football this year, whereas Cincinnati ranks 6th. And in neutral game script situations, both teams are top 10. That means more volume, which means more potential scoring. And that means more fantasy points. So I like Kyler Murray because of that fact, but also because Cincinnati's defense is terrible. Every quarterback they've faced has thrown at least one touchdown this year, and they've allowed the 4th highest yards per attempt rate. But Andy Dalton is in play as a streamer too. Arizona ranks 5th worst in yards per attempt, and before last week when Russell Wilson was pretty average fantasy-wise against them, the Cardinals had allowed 3 straight top 6 performances to fantasy quarterbacks. And the difference between Dalton and someone like Russell Wilson is that Dalton's defense isn't likely to step up the way Seattle's did last week. That should lead to a more pass-heavy script for Andy Dalton. But like I said, that game has a lot of potential fantasy value, and I think that both quarterbacks are in play. And so is Jacoby Brissett. We'll have to see if T.Y. Hilton plays. That would make me feel a lot better about using Brissett this week. And as I mentioned on yesterday's 10 Trends show, Brissett does have some touchdown regression coming. His touchdown rate this year is far above expectation. Now, with that being said, this is a good spot for any quarterback. He's playing in the highest over-under game of the week against Kansas City, and even if that regression does hit from an efficiency standpoint, he'll likely throw the ball more than usual given this matchup against the Chiefs. Kansas City ranks in the top 10 in fantasy points against to the quarterback position, with the only big flop being Derek Carr. So Brissett is a good streamer if you need one, but I would feel better about it if T.Y. Hilton were playing. Now, as for quarterbacks that I'm lower on versus the consensus, I'm sort of surprised to see Aaron Rodgers easily ranked as a top 10 quarterback this week. Now, the positives are that he's Aaron Rodgers and we know that there's a ceiling there, albeit one that's a little bit overstated. But look at the negatives. He's on the road. He's facing a Dallas team that hasn't faced a good quarterback yet this year, so there's some ambiguity with how strong this matchup is. And Devontae Adams probably isn't playing. So I don't mind Aaron Rodgers, but I think he's more of a fringe top 10 play rather than a locked-in one. There are enough question marks about that situation for me to rather play someone like Matt Ryan or Carson Wentz. I actually like Wentz a lot more than where he's being ranked too. And then there's Daniel Jones. After that big performance against Tampa Bay, he had an average one in Week 4. He looked like a rookie in Week 4. And I'm worried about him going up against Minnesota this week. He's at home, that's good, but Minnesota's held Matt Ryan to a QB 14 performance, Aaron Rodgers to a QB 19 one, Derek Carr to QB 20, and then last week, we didn't see much from the Chicago quarterbacks. Adjusted for strength of opponent, Minnesota's defense is a top 10 one according to NumberFire's expected points model. So if you're looking at Daniel Jones as a potential play this week, I think someone like Andy Dalton makes a lot more sense, even with Golden Tate coming back for Daniel Jones. Jordan Howard saw over half of Philadelphia's offensive snaps in Week 4. He saw a season-high 55.6% of the Eagles' running back carries. He saw a season-high 14.8% of the team's targets, and he saw 3 goal line rushes. The Philadelphia backfield is going to be tough to predict and utilize each week. I totally get that. But Philadelphia is facing the Jets. They're huge favorites, so both Jordan Howard and Miles Sanders can eat. I'm just surprised the two of them are as close as they are right now in ranking over on Fantasy Pros. They're like 4 spots from one another. I strongly prefer Howard given what we saw last week, though Sanders could be a fine flex option. Now, I've picked on Sony Michel a good bit this year, but I don't mind him in this week's matchup against Washington. Washington's allowed the 7th most running back rushing yards to start the season. They're coming off a game where Wayne Gallman finishes a top 5 option against them. And once again, game script should favor New England. That hasn't mattered all that much for Sony Michel this year, but it was good to see him get nearly 90% of New England's running back rushes last week after seeing him get just 41% of them the week before. So if that usage keeps up, he should be fine for week 5, especially in a non-PPR format. I want to also note that the gap between James Conner and Jalen Samuels this week doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. And that's all based on what we saw in week 4, which was Jalen Samuels actually touching the ball more than James Conner did. Like, I would choose Conner over Jalen Samuels straight up, but there's a 28 running back player gap between those two players over on Fantasy Pros. If that's how people are viewing Jalen Samuels, then I guess I'm higher than most on Jalen Samuels, especially given Conner's dealing with a minor ankle injury. So I apparently like Jalen Samuels a lot more than the consensus. Now, my deeper play of the week would look better if Marlon Mack is indeed out with his ankle injury, but I think you can play Nyheim Hines as a desperation move even if Marlon Mack goes. FanDuel Sportsbook has the Colts as 11-point underdogs, which means if game script goes as predicted, they'll be in hurry-up mode. And when that's the case, it's Nyheim Hines who can see the field. Hines had 6 targets last week in a negative game script, and you might be thinking that had something to do with Marlon Mack getting injured. But head coach Frank Reich said that Marlon Mack wasn't medically ruled out of that game. I'm sure the snap share wouldn't have favored Nyheim Hines the way that it did if Marlon Mack were perfectly healthy. But we've seen Hines with good target totals in negative game scripts. And this is the type of game where things could go south for Indianapolis. Now, I wouldn't play him in a standard league, but it's not a bad deep option in a PPR one. On the other side of things, I'm worried about Le'Veon Bell this week, even if Sam Darnold does play. Like, you can't bench Le'Veon Bell. He's seen 89% of New York's running back rushes this year and almost 25% of the team's targets. His workload is insanity, but he's facing arguably the best run defense in the NFL, which means most of what he does this week is likely to come through the air. And his scoring upside isn't very strong, with the Jets having the second lowest implied team total of any team on this slate. I just think that we could be in store for another performance like we saw in week 3 against New England, where Bell finishes the RB31. It's not the best spot in the world for him. And I want to take a minute and talk about LaShawn McCoy too. Now, don't take this the wrong way. I think that McCoy is a fine play this weekend. The Chiefs are big favorites, so he's likely to see some work. But McCoy saw 58% of Kansas City's running back rushes this past week when Darrell Williams was at 42%. And both players had an identical target share. It sounds like Damian Williams is not practicing too. That just adds to the potential mess that we'll see in that backfield in week 5. So I like Shady, but having him as a fringe RB1 is a little bit aggressive. But as usual, if your running back is seeing volume, he's likely a decent starter. It's tough to knock a lot of running backs each week for matchups because it matters less when the position has so few players who are seeing significant work. Now, at wide receiver this week, I love me some Tyler Boyd. And with John Ross out, Auden Tate isn't a bad play either. But let's focus on Tyler Boyd. He's played over 63% of the team's snaps from the slot this season, which is the highest on the Bengals. And Arizona not only has been bad at stopping anyone in their secondary, but over 40% of the targets seen against them this season have gone to pass catchers in the slot. It's one of the highest rates in football. They've allowed the most touchdowns, or they're tied for the most touchdowns allowed, to players who are lined up in the slot as well. Now, as I mentioned, this game could see a lot of volume given the fast-paced nature of it. So I think Tyler Boyd is a really, really good option this week, at least a very, very good high floor option. Some of you might be nervous about Allen Robinson with Chase Daniel under center, but I think that he's a really solid option still, especially this week against Oakland. The Raiders have allowed the 6th most fantasy points to wideouts this year, and as I talked about on yesterday's 10 Trends show, Robinson is one of just a handful of receivers with a 20% target share in each of his first 4 games this year. So that includes last week when Daniel was quarterbacking. So don't pull Allen Robinson from your lineup because of this quarterback change. I'm still going to have a hard time benching Hollywood Brown where I have him as well. The matchup against Pittsburgh isn't bad at all, and as I keep saying with Brown, the peripherals are there. He's seen a quarter of Baltimore's targets this season despite a slow start from the year from a snap standpoint, and only Mike Evans and Keenan Allen have more air yards than Hollywood Brown. Eventually, it's going to happen. Eventually, he's going to hit. And then my last wide receiver that I'm interested in this week, or who I think that people are too low on, is Will Fuller. Fuller's been a disappointment this season. In weekly PPR scoring, he's yet to finish higher than wide receiver 48 in a single week this year. But with that being said, his last 3 games have seen a 24%, a 21%, and a 19% target share. And according to airyards.com, Fuller actually ranks just outside the top 10 in air yards. And he and the Texans' passing attack could be in store for a huge bounce-back game this week against Atlanta, who looked awful last week without Keanu Neal. So I think Fuller's not a bad play in week 5. Now, on the other side of things, I have some worries about Sterling Shepard with Golden Tate returning. Mostly because I don't know what the usage is going to look like and where he's going to be lined up. On the year, and this is according to Pro Football Focus, but this season, Shepard's run about 80% of his routes from the slot. So what happens when Golden Tate, a slot receiver, is active? Shepard will probably move to the outside, where he's going to find less advantageous matchups. So I think you can still play Shepard this week, but there are some question marks with how his usage will look moving forward. And speaking of usage, Juju Smith-Schuster's not seeing it without Ben Roethlisberger. He saw just 13% of Pittsburgh's targets against Cincinnati on Monday night. He has a far less enticing matchup this week against Baltimore, but yet he's still being ranked as a fringe wide receiver 1. Of course he has that type of upside, but until we start seeing more consistent volume, we shouldn't feel like he's that strong of a fantasy asset. We have to adjust with this new information. And the same goes for DJ Moore. I talked about this on the 10 Trends show yesterday that I keep referencing, but Moore's seen his target share dip dramatically with Kyle Allen under center. With Cam this year, it was in the 27% and 28% range. With Allen, it's barely been in the double digits. Now, you can't bench Juju, but you may be able to bench DJ Moore against Jacksonville this week. It's a good process move, even if he does come through and have a decent game. You have to see more volume before you can trust him. Jimmy Graham is technically a tight end streamer this week, or he was at the start of the week, so I figured that I'd talk about him in this tight end section on today's show. With Devontae Adams banged up last week, Graham saw some end zone work, and he ended the game with an 18% target share. His 2 previous games saw him with a 6% share and a 3% share. So without Devontae Adams, he becomes a more important red zone threat for Green Bay, and he's not a terrible option at a very terrible position. And then there's Tyler Eifert. At this point, even my daughter, who can only say the words touchdown and bubble, even she knows to play tight ends against the Arizona Cardinals. So far this season, the Cardinals have given up 6 touchdowns to tight ends. No other team has given up more than 3. They've also allowed 431 receiving yards to the position, when the second-place Buccaneers have allowed 365. Eifert isn't hugely involved in the offense given his 10.6% target share, but without John Ross and given this matchup, this could be a good week for him. Now, the first streaming defense that you can play this week is the Tennessee Titans. Now, at the time of this recording, I have no idea if Josh Allen is going to play for the Bills this weekend. But even if he does, it's not like it's a bad matchup for Tennessee. They're 3-point favorites. There's a low 38.5 point over-under over on FanDuel Sportsbook. And 2 of the 4 defenses to face the Bills this year have ranked in the top 3 in weekly scoring. The other 2 who didn't were the Giants and Bengals, 2 really bad units. So the Titans should be absolutely fine as a defensive play. And like I said on the 15 Transactions episode earlier this week, the Carolina Panthers are in a great spot. They currently lead the league in sack rate, and they're facing a Jacksonville team in Charlotte this week, so they're at home. But Jacksonville ranks just outside the top 10 in sack rate allowed. And this game also has a pretty low over-under, so the Panthers should provide a nice floor. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you get subscribed to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter at LateRoundQB. If you have start-sit questions, you can always hit me up on there, or tune into my weekly Facebook Live on the FanDuel Facebook page every Sunday morning at noon Eastern. I guess it's not morning, but it's at noon Eastern. That's the best place to reach me for those questions. Thanks, everyone. I'll be back tomorrow for the last show of the week, the mailbag episode.